In this lesson, we will be discussing pattern tracking, what your life has been trying to tell you for years. There's a conversation I've had many times with different people in different circumstances about different situations. It goes like this. Someone is describing something painful, a relationship that ends badly, a professional situation that collapses, a friendship that dissolved in a way that left them confused and hurt. And somewhere in the middle of that description, they say it almost unprompted. I don't know why this keeps happening to me. Not this happened, this keeps happening. And when I asked them to say more about that, what do you mean keeps happening? They start to describe sometimes, for the first time out loud, a pattern that has been living inside for years, sometimes decades. The same kind of relationship dynamic, different people, the same professional collapse at the same point in the arc, the same rupture, same wound, same confusion, same question, why me? Why again? Why can't I get past this? Here's what I actually want to offer as a reframe before we go any further. The pattern isn't happening to you. I'll say it again. The pattern isn't happening to you. The pattern is you, or more precisely, it's a part of you that hasn't been seen clearly yet. A structure in your interior that keeps generating the same exterior results because nothing has changed the interior conditioning producing it. That's not a condemnation. That's not a condemnation. It's actually the most hopeful possible framing, because things that are happening to you are outside your influence. Structures operating from you can be examined, understood, and changed. Pattern tracking is how you make that examination possible. Not through analysis, not through therapy necessarily, though therapy can help, through systematic, patient, honest observation of your own life over time. 90 days. That's what it takes to see the structure clearly. This video is the walkthrough. What patterns actually are. Before we get into the system, I wanted to be precise about what we are actually tracking. Because people hear the word pattern and immediately think of the obvious surface level repetition. Same type of romantic partner, same kind of conflict at work, same self-sabotage before a deadline. These are real patterns, but they are symptoms. What we're tracking underneath them is the structure that generates them. Let me give you a more precise definition. A pattern, in the way I'm using the word here, is a recurring sequence of interior states and exterior responses that produces consistent outcomes across different contexts. Let's break it down. Recurring sequence. It doesn't happen once. It has a rhythm, a predictable arc. Interior states. It starts inside, a feeling, a perception, a meaning-making mood, something you experience before anything external happens. Exterior responses. The behavior that follows from the interior states, what you do when you say, how you engage. Consistent outcomes. The result which looks different on the surface, different person, different situation, but lands in the same place emotionally every time. The surface events vary. The underlying sequence is identical. Here's a simple example of what that looks like in the practice. Someone feels unseen or undervalued in a relationship. That's the interior state. They respond by withdrawing and becoming self-sufficient rather than expressing a need. That's the exterior response. The other person, not knowing what's wrong, pulls back too. The original feeling of being unseen intensifies. That's the consistent outcomes. The relationship either ends or stabilizes at a permanent distance. This sequence can run in a romantic relationship, a friendship, a professional dynamic, a family relationship. Different people, same sequence, same outcome. The surface story each time is different. The structure underneath is identical. That's what we're tracking, not the events, the sequence. Now, why do we miss that? If patterns are visible, if the sequence is consistent, why do we miss them? 3 reasons. All of them are structural. The first is context variation. The surface of each pattern instance looks different. Different person, different industry, different city, different decade. Our brains are meaning-making machines that are very good at categorizing by surface features. The relationship with the unavailable partner in your 20s looks nothing like the friendship with the emotionally withholding colleague in your 30s. They're filed in different categories. But the interior sequence, the feeling of not being enough to earn real closeness, the response of working harder to compensate, the exhaustion that follows, the eventual collapse, is identical. We miss the pattern because we're looking at the surface, and the surface keeps changing. The second is narrative momentum. When we're inside an experience, we are inside the story of it. We are managing it, responding to it, trying to resolve it. We don't have the distance to see it as an instant of something recurring. The perspective required to recognize a pattern is retrospective. You need to be inside the story, looking at multiple instances simultaneously to see the structure. Most people never create that perspective deliberately. They move from one instant to the next, carrying the wound but not the map. The third is the protection function of not seeing. This one is the most important and the most uncomfortable. Some patterns are invisible because we are making them invisible. Because seeing the pattern clearly would require acknowledging something we are not ready to acknowledge. That's the relationship dynamic I keep recreating originates in a wound I haven't addressed. That the professional collapse I keep experiencing is connected to a belief about my own worth that I've never examined. that the relationship or the friendship ruptures aren't bad luck. They are the predictable result of something I'm doing that I haven't been willing to look at. The psyche has a sophisticated self-protection system, and one of its primary tools is strategic not seeing, keeping certain truths just below the threshold of full consciousness where they influence behavior without being available for examination. Pattern tracking is a deliberate override of that protection system, which is why it requires commitment, consistency, and a specific kind of courage. Not the courage to be dramatic, the courage to be honest when the honest thing is inconvenient. Let's look at the 90-day system. The system I'm about to walk you through has 3 phases of 30 days each. Or let's look at that. Collection, recognition, and interpretation. Say it again. Collection, recognition, and interpretation. Each phase has a distinct purpose and a distinct set of instruction. The phase builds on each other, which means you can't skip ahead. The recognition that happens in phase 2 depends on the collection that happened in phase 1. The interpretation that happens in phase 3 depends on both. So before I walk you through each phase, I want to establish the tools you'll need. They are deliberately minimal. Here's what you need. A dedicated document, not your general journal, not the notes app where you keep everything else. A single document used only for this. A physical notebook or digital, it doesn't matter. Separation is what matters. A consistent notation format. I'll give you the exact format in a minute. A commitment to entry within 24 hours of a pattern instant. Not eventually, but within 24 hours, while the interior texture of the experience is still accessible. That's it. No app required. No elaborate system. The simplicity is intentional. Complexity becomes a reason to stop. Now let's look at the notation format. Every entry has 4 components. Brief, honest, no elaboration required in phase 1. So, date, then a surface event. It tells you what happened in externally 1 or 2 sentences. The interior state, what you felt before, during, and after situation. And familiar quality, the specific quality that felt like, here we go again. Just 1 sentence. So you have the date, then the surface event, what happened externally, maybe 1 or 2 sentences. Then you have the interior state, what you felt before, during, and after, about 2 sentences, no more than 2 sentences. And then the familiar quality, the specific quality that felt like, here we go again. 1 sentence for the familiar quality. That's the entire entry. Most entry will take you about 3 to 5 minutes. The critical field is the last one, the familiar quality. That's where the pattern lives. Not in the surface event, not even in the interior state in isolation, but in that specific quality of recognition, the felt sense of repetition. If you can't identify the familiar quality, if this instance doesn't have the sense of here we go again, don't log it. This system is specifically for the recurrent, not the novel. You're looking for the recurrent patterns. So what then triggers a log entry? 3 types of events warrant logging. Event number 1. Any situation that produces a strong negative interior response that feels disproportionate to the surface event. The reaction that's bigger than what the situation seems to warrant, that disproportionately is always a signal that the current event is activating something older. Event number 2. Any situation that ends in an outcome you have experienced before in a different context. The relationship that ends the same way. The professional dynamic that produces the same result. The conversation that lands in the same place. It always does. And number 3. Event number 3. Any moment where you catch yourself thinking or saying, this always happened to me. That phrase is a direct signal. Log it. So let's look at days 1 to 30, the collection phase. The first 30 days have one job: collect without analyzing, no analysis. This is harder than it sounds. The mind wants to understand immediately, to connect the dots before it has enough dots to connect, to reach for meaning before the data is complete. Resist that. In the collection phase, your only job is to notice and record faithfully, honestly, without interpretation. Every time you feel the familiar quality, log it. Surface event, interior state, familiar quality. 3 to 5 minutes. Done. If you think will have always happened during this phase that are worth anticipating, you'll be surprised by the frequency most people, once they start actively noticing, find pattern instances appearing far more often than they expected. Multiple times a week, sometimes daily, the pattern felt like an occasional occurrence reveals itself as a near constant background present. Don't be alarmed by this. The frequency was always there. You are just filtering it out. The logging is making the invisible visible. You want to skip entries. There will be instances where you know you should log something and you don't want to. Too tired, too close, too uncomfortable with what the entry will require you to admit. Log it anyway. The entries you most want to skip are frequently the most important ones. You will start seeing surface connections by week 3. You probably start noticing themes. The same 2 or 3 interior states showing up repeatedly. The same quality of familiar recognition. Note these observances separately from your entries. Don't let them contaminate the collection phase data. You're not interpreting yet. You're building the data set that interpretation will require. At the end of 30 days, you should have something between 15 and 40 entries. That's your raw material. Days 31 to 60, the recognition phase. At the start of day 31, do one thing before you add any new entries. Read back through everything you have collected, all of it, start to finish, without stopping to analyze. Just read. Then close the document and sit for 10 minutes without doing anything. What you're looking for in that reading and what tends to surface in the 10 minutes after is the felt sense of the structure. Not the intellectual identification of pattern, the felt recognition of it. There's a difference. The intellectual identification says, I see the same interior state appears in multiple entries. The felt recognition says, oh, this is the thing. I know this thing. I've known this thing for a long time. The felt recognition is what you're waiting for. It may come during the reading. It may come in the 10 minutes after. It may take a few days of continued logging before it crystallizes. When it arrives, write it down in plain language. No jargon, no spiritual framing, just the honest description of what you're seeing. For example, I consistently feel unseen when I perceive someone pulling back, and I respond by withdrawing further rather than reaching towards them, which produces exactly this disconnection I was afraid of. See that? That's a pattern statement. Simple, specific, first person, present tense. Most people find that they have between 2 and 5 core patterns. Rarely more than that. The surface variation is enormous, but underneath it, the structures are few. During days 31 to 60, you continue logging new instances while also refining your pattern statements. Each new entry now has an additional field, pattern. Which pattern statement this instant reflect? You're starting to categorize to see which instance belongs to which underlying structure. The categorization does something important. It begins to dissolve the senses that you're having many different experiences and replaces it with the recognition you're having a small number of experiences very frequently in many different costumes. That recognition, while initially uncomfortable, is the profoundly clarifying. Because a small number of patterns is workable. An infinite variety of painful experience is overwhelming. The recognition phase reduces the overwhelming to workable. Now we look at days 61 to 90, the interpretation phase. By day 61, you have something most people never have. A documented, categorized record of your own interior operating system. 60 days of honest data about how you actually function. Not how you think you function. Not how you think you function. Not how you like to function. But how you actually, demonstratively, repeatedly function. The interpretation phase is where you ask the deeper question about what you have found. 3 questions. 1 per week for the first 3 weeks. The 4th week is integration. Week 1. Question, where did this come from? Every pattern has an origin, a context in which it was adaptive, in which the interior state and the exterior response made sense given what was available at that time. The child who learned that needs weren't safe to express, who adapted by becoming self-sufficient, who carried that adaptation into adult relationship where it generates the same disconnection it was designed to prevent. The pattern makes sense in context. It was a solution to a real problem. It just became outdated. You're not looking for someone to blame. You're looking for the context that made the pattern logical. That context is almost always early and almost always involves the condition under which you learn what was safe to be. This question isn't about reopening wounds. It's about understanding the origin well enough to stop mistaking an outdated adaptation for a fixed personality trait. This is not who I am. This is what I learned to do. There is a difference. Week 2 questions. What is a pattern protecting? Every pattern, even the ones that causes you significant pain, is protecting something. There's logic to it, a function. The withdrawal that generates disconnection is protecting against the vulnerability of reaching and being able to be rejected. The self-sabotage before success is protecting against the fear of what visibility might cost. The conflict that ends relationships is protecting against the deeper intimacy that would require being fully known. When you can see what the pattern is protecting, when you can name the fear underneath the behavior, you have something you didn't have before. You have the actual thing to address, not the behavior. The fear, the behavior is organized around. This is significant because most attempts to change patterns work on the behavior level. Stop withdrawing, stop self-sabotaging, stop creating conflict. And they fail repeatedly because the fear underneath hasn't been addressed. The behavior changes temporarily and then returns because the fear is still there requiring protection. Finding a new vehicle for the same function. Address the fear, the behavior follows. Week 3 questions. What would the pattern-free variation look like? Not who you'd be without the pattern. That's too abstract. What would a specific recent pattern instant have looked like if you responded to them from a different place? The conversation where you withdrew, what would reaching towards have looked like? What would you have said? How would it have felt? The professional moment where you self-sabotage, what would staying present have required? What would you have had to tolerate? This isn't visualization in the manifestation sense. It is a precision exercise in understanding the specific behavioral alternative that the pattern is currently blocking. Because changes doesn't happen at the level of general intention, I want to be more open. It happens at the level of specific behavior in specific moments. In this kind of conversation, when I feel this particular interior state, I will do this specific thing instead of the habitual thing. The more precisely you can describe the alternative, the more available it becomes when the moment arrives. Week number 4, integration. No new questions, no new analysis. Read back through everything, all 90 days, the collection, the recognition, the interpretation. Then write one page, not in your tracking document, a separate page. 3 things on that page. 3 things. The pattern, stated simply. What it cost you, what addressing it would make possible. Not for anyone else, for you, so that when the pattern activates, when you are inside the familiar sequence and the habitual response is pulling you, you have a clear, honest statement of why the work matters. That page is the anchor. Return to it when the work gets hard. So the question then is, what do you do with what you find? 90 days of honest tracking will service things that require more than just a practice to address. I want to be straightforward about that. Some of what you find will be workable through the practices in this series: the honest inventory, the deliberate stillness, the honest speech, the layer work. These are real tools and they produce real change in the patterns that are available to self-directed work. But some patterns are rooted deeply enough in early experience in attachment wounds in trauma that they require professional support to address them. Not because you're broken, but because some roots go below the depth that solo excavation can safely reach. There's nothing in this series that is a substitute for therapy when therapy is what is needed. And pattern tracking, done honestly, will tell you whether that threshold has been reached. If what services in the interpretation phase is too large, too raw, or too destabilizing to hold alone, that's not a failure of the practice. That's the practice working. It's showing you where the real work is and that you shouldn't do it alone. Take that seriously. For patterns that are workable through self-directed practice, here's the framework: catch, name, choose. Catch. Notice the moment the pattern is activated. The familiar interior states beginning. The sequence started. Name. Say it internally, precisely. This is the withdrawal pattern. This is the fear of being unseen activated. I know this sequence. The naming alone interrupts the naming alone interrupts the automaticity. You can't be fully inside a pattern simultaneously observing. The observation creates a gap. Choose. Choose from that gap. Make a different choice, not the complete opposite of the habitual response necessarily, the smallest available movement towards the pattern-free version you identified in week 3. Catch, name, choose. Every instance, every time. You will not do it perfectly. You will catch some and miss others. You will name it and choose habitual response anyway. On days when the fear is too loud. That's not failure. That's the nature of the world. The pattern was built over years. It changes over months. The measure of progress isn't perfection. It's the gradual shift in the ratio. More catches, more choices, more instances where the habitual response didn't get the automatic right the way it used to have. The ratio shifts slowly, and then at some point you realize it has shifted significantly. The pattern that ran your life is still visible. Patterns don't disappear, but it no longer has the same automatic authority it once did. That's the return on 90 days of honest work. So let's close. I want to close with something that took me a long time to understand about this work. Seeing your pattern clearly is not the same as being defined by them. There's a version of self-examination that becomes its own trap, where the honest look at yourself curdles into a fixed story. I'm someone who does this. This is my damage. This is my limitation. And that story becomes its own kind of cave. The point of pattern tracking is not to give you a more accurate negative self-narrative. is to give you enough clarity about the operating structure that you can work with it rather than being unconsciously run by it. The pattern is not you. It's a structure that formed in you in response to real condition that has been operating without your full awareness or consent. Seeing it clearly is the beginning of that change. Not overnight, not completely, but genuinely, measurably in the actual texture of your daily life. The philosopher Simone Weil wrote something that I've returned to many times in the context of this kind of work. She said, "Attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity." She's talking about attention towards others, but I think it applies inwards too. The attention you bring to your own patterns, honest, patient, without judgment, is an act of generosity towards yourself, towards the parts of you that have been running outdated programs in the dark for years, doing the best they could with what they had. See them clearly, understand what they're trying to do, and then slowly give them something better to work with. That's the whole practice.